All right, we're going to conclude our look at Perelandra today. We left off our last lecture with looking at the confrontation between the two figures that were central to Out of the Silent Planet as well, namely the figures of Weston and Ransom. Weston representing the scientist of two types. When it was Out of the Silent Planet, he represented an old way of understanding human nature and appropriating life and the purposes of science, namely that of expanding or increasing the power of mankind throughout the cosmos, bringing everything under his dominion, even at the expense of all other forms of life. That Ransom, or that Weston rather, looks back upon his own life with considerable regret and realizes that he was wrong on many levels, but chiefly insofar as that he lacked a spiritual sense of what life was, if you will recall. And he now realized that the spirit was of all importance and that life should be embraced for the sake of life. In both cases, Lewis, speaking through the person of his hero, Ransom, is opposed. And in the latter case of this spirituality, I spent some time talking about how this view is largely that of the post-humanist way of looking at things, or if you will, the pantheist way, which Lewis himself identifies with the thought of Hegel back in Mere Christianity, as I say, book 2, chapter 1, if you wanted to consult with that further and have a look at what Lewis says at some greater length on that subject. But we left off with the two of them in mortal combat, Lewis having, or Ransom rather, having agreed or recognized that the reason that he'd been brought onto Perelandra was to stop Weston and stop the perversion of this world. And but that he was going to have to do not through spiritual means, but rather through physical means. And he had, at some pains, come to that recognition. There's a resistance on his part. We talked about the inner and the dialogue below and the dialogue above, and the distinction between the truth from myth and of both from fact, which can happen on our world, did not apply in this world. And so the fight that he was going to have to undertake in order to rescue the Green Lady was in fact going to have to be a physical fight, and that's where we left off last time, with Weston and Ransom now undergoing a physical fight, and he had punched Weston in the jaw, and at that point feared that he was going to lose, simply because, of course, he was not only facing Weston, but what inhabited him. But when it comes down to the physical fight, it just was that, and there was no other power at work there. So I wanted to pick up there where I left off with that, the creature, the Unman speaks and cites the last words of Christ of being forsaken, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and he realized to his horror that he wasn't quoting it, he was remembering it. So to terrify Ransom, the devil speaks these words. And there's an interesting passage there in what follows, in which, and this will be around chapter 12, I think we left it off at. And remember, his name is Ransom, and not for nothing is he named Ransom, for that matter. So he is in some ways following in the path of Christ, imitatio Christi here. And a fight breaks out, and sorry, I need to turn the light on here to actually see my notes here. He fights against this man. Now, one of the things that comes out of the narrative here is that when he is fighting against Weston, he is actually fighting something of the man, but more than anything, and more eventually, he becomes he's fighting against corruption, not just corrupted will, but corruption itself, and needs to overcome that. And so Lewis makes some interesting comments here, rather Ransom speaking through him. And I'm going to read some of this here. Oh no, that's good. That's jumping ahead a little bit here. He notes that that the corruption with which will was attached only as an instrument is what he now encounters in the person of Weston here. In our world, you could detach the sinner from the sin. Here, the sinner is really little other than the sin, and that's what he's fighting against in the person of Weston. And there's some really interesting passages there. That was on page 156, by the way. And then Lewis reflects a little bit later on, this is in chapter 12, on the essential disorder of our century. And Lewis here is reflecting on the influence of Darwinism and other forms of disordered essentialism in our thought. And I'll just read the passage because I find it quite fascinating. Because he's on his own at this point. He's knocked Weston down. He's not quite gone yet, but he's in solitude. And he said, like all solitudes, it was indeed haunted, but not by an anthropomorphic deity, rather by the holy inscrutable, to which man and his life remained eternally irrelevant. And beyond this ocean was space itself. Now remember that reflection on space, which was so important in Out of the Silent Planet. Space with the connotations of absence, as opposed to the deep heaven that he'd been reflecting on, that is Lewis in this work and throughout his sci-fi trilogy. He said, in vain did Ransom try to remember that he had been in quote-unquote space and found it heaven, tingling with a fullness of life for which infinity itself was not 1 cubic inch too large. All that seemed like a dream. That opposite mode of thought, which he had often mocked and called in mockery the empirical bogey, came surging into his mind. What was that? The great myth of our century, with its gases and galaxies, its light years and evolutions, its nightmare perspectives of simple arithmetic, in which everything that can possibly hold significance for the mind becomes the mere byproduct of essential disorder. So what he's talking about here is the ongoing effect of the loss of what he catalogs in that work, The Discarded Image. Every resting place for thought, everything that has significance, is being removed by modern physics, by the modern human sciences, for that matter. Is being dismissed as the product of, instead of an essential disorder. So rather than an ordered cosmos, according to which we can reason and understand things, it is being replaced by this view of life as essentially disordered and chaotic. There's no meter, there's no rhythm, there is no harmony, there is no law, there's no purpose, there is no significance at all. It's a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing, full of sound and fury at that matter, for that matter. And so he is speaking and reflecting on this, and how much his own intellectual landscape has been informed by this idea of an essential disorder. And being on Perelandra, he's being reacquainted how the exact opposite is true. There's an essential order to all things. And when he reflects on that, he moves, the figure of Weston returns to him at this point. So he said, and in reflection on this essential disorder, I read on, he says, always till now he had belittled it, had treated with a certain disdain its flat superlatives, its clownish amazement that different things should be of different sizes, its glib munificence of ciphers. Even now his reason was not quite subdued, though his heart would not listen to his reason. Part of him still knew that the size of a thing is its least important characteristic, that the material universe derived from the comparing and the mythopoeic power within him had that very majesty before which he was now asked to abuse himself, and that mere numbers could not overawe us unless we lent them from our own resources that awfulness which they themselves could no more supply than a banker's ledger. But this knowledge remained an abstraction. Mere bigness and loneliness overbore him. So what he's doing at that, what he's undergoing at this point is a sort of a dereliction. He is abandoned, and he's now even entertaining the things which he formerly thought were ridiculous, like the idea of an essential disorder in the universe. He's even come to that level, and in a sense, he's coming very close to the perspective of Weston. And at this point, he starts to hear a voice, and it's the voice of the Unman, as he's now described. And he simply now speaks out to Ransom. Ransom, it said feebly. Ransom held his tongue. He was not going to encourage it to start that game again. Ransom, it said in a broken voice, for God's sake, speak to me. He glanced at it in surprise. Tears were on its cheeks, etc. And at this point, the final conflict between the two arises. And at this point, something like an argument ensues between them. It isn't an argument, a dispute and a discussion, a dialogue between the two. And Weston is returned here for the final purposes of trying to bring Ransom down. And Weston's true motive for seeking to avoid death is revealed. And what is that motive? Well, the motive is that he's actually experienced it. So let me pick it up here, 169. Weston says to him, he's trying to explain to him why life was so important to him. Remember, he had wanted to advance first human life and then embrace life and itself. And the reason why is the horror of death. And he talks about this in various ways. And Ransom simply doesn't understand him. Why on earth are you reflecting on that? But Weston responds to him, that's why it's so important to live as long as you can. All the good things are now a thin little rind of what we call life, put on for show, and then the real universe forever and ever. To thicken the rind by 1 centimeter, to live 1 week, 1 day, 1 half hour longer, that's the only thing that matters. Of course, you don't know it, but every man who is waiting to be hanged knows it. You say, what difference does a short reprieve make? What difference? But nobody need go there. The reason why Weston speaks of this is because he has actually seen and experienced what death is. And so he comes back speaking to Ransom as someone who knows now what death is. Remember, he was going to teach the Green Lady death. Well, now he himself has finally experienced it. And when he, in reflection on that, he talks about life as something that would need to be desperately to be held on to. And Ransom says to him, there is an alternative. And announces that Weston doesn't believe in God. And Ransom is still trying to reason with Weston, and says if you call it monstrous, then, and then he's now going into one of his usual, Lewis's usual lines of argumentation. If you have this sense of monstrosity, you must also have a sense of goodness. And if you have a sense of goodness, then you're not wholly gone and you can move in the right direction. But of course, Weston cuts him off and says that would all be very well if it wasn't that reasoning itself is only valid as long as you stay in the rind, that is, in the land of the living. It has nothing to do with the real universe. Now, the real universe of which Weston is speaking is the one in which he now inhabits, namely of hell, which is absent of all things that we associate with goodness, rationality, and life. It's the privation of the good. He's describing the nature of evil here. And he said, haven't you seen the real meaning of all this modern stuff about the dangers of extrapolation and bent space and the indeterminacy of the atom? They don't say in so many words, of course, but they're getting to. But even before they die nowadays is what all men get to when they're dead. The knowledge that reality is neither rational nor consistent nor anything else. And so the true world for Weston is the true reality is nothingness. It's death. Now, this is not true, but it's his experience now because he's in fact embraced the pure spirituality of the pantheist, in which goodness and evil are coterminous, in which what the devil calls good is in fact his good, but it is of no good. But they go back and forth with this misconception here, which Weston is trying to present to him as the real reality. I mean, it's the reality he experienced, but it's not the one that Ransom experiences. And he does it simply as, I think, as a ruse. He is speaking of something that he had experienced, but he's trying to get closer to Ransom in order to kill Ransom. And he does do exactly that. He gets close enough to him to grab hold of him, and then he jumps off the horses and into the water, and they drown. They go down, 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 down into the water. And they descend to the point where it appears that Ransom is not going to come back up. And then he gets a sense of rising from the water. And Ransom speaks here now of, he's not sure who he's speaking to, by the way, when he's speaking to Weston. Is it the devil? Is it Ransom? Or is it Weston? Who knows? And it's not really that clear either. But he tries to drown him. And really fascinating lines here. Top of 173. He says, he was nearly fainting himself. This is Ransom, but he counted 1,000 before he could shift his posture. Even then, he continued to sit on its body. He did not know whether in the last few hours the spirit which had spoken to him was really Weston's, or whether he'd been the victim of a ruse. Indeed, it made little difference. There was no doubt a confusion of persons in damnation. What pantheists falsely hoped of heaven, bad men really received in hell. They were melted down into their master, as a lead soldier slips down and loses his shape in the ladle held over the gas ring. The question whether Satan, or one whom Satan has digested, is acting on any given occasion has in the long run no clear significance. In the meantime, the great thing was not to be tricked again. So it was all a ruse, a trick, and whether he was speaking to Weston, the man he once knew, or whether he was in fact being spoken to by the devil speaking through Weston was almost irrelevant, because that man had ceased to exist. He was now consumed by the evil one. And they had been dragged, as I say, line 174, by some 100th chance, had been carried through a hole in the cliffs well below water level and come up on the beach of a cavern. Now, where is this? It's unclear. It's unclear, but they've come down deep, 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 dragged down, and somehow managed to come up through into a large cave. And the cave is marked by blackness. It's dark. It's as dark as pitch. There is no light there at all. And the only thing that will guide him through this is a stream. Now, streams, biblically speaking, streams have connotations of the presence of God. And so there may be something of that in Lewis's presentation here, but there's no actual recognition that that is the case here, but it's a stream. The stream's flowing from somewhere, so he follows the stream. That's his means of sight. Here is the stream, and he follows the stream upward into a cavern. And what I'm wondering here, and I've thought about this as I've read this over the years, and I read it and I read it and I read it, is he moving towards something along the lines of what we get in Dante, namely Mount Purgatory? Has he descended down in through the abyss, down into the center of the earth, down into going from something akin to a journey down into hell, and then popped out the other side and is now going up through the darkness and is going to ascend Mount Purgatory? I think this is effectively what is happening here. But of course, the difference there is that the sin has not happened. It's stopped, but there's an analogy of some sort transpiring here. He goes down into the underworld, into hell of sorts, defeats the devil there, leaves him there, and then comes up the other side through a phase of terrific blackness, darkness, and then he comes to some sort of a mountain, and it's called later on in the text in Perelandra a holy mountain, for that matter. Now, in Scripture, the holy mountain of God is the kingdom of God, referred to in various places in Scripture. This holy mountain. It could also be Mount Purgatory. Both are possible here, and the imagery suggests something of heaven, and not just Dante's Mount Purgatory. But at the height of Mount Purgatory, in Dante's conception, there is an earthly paradise. That seems to fit what we will find when we meet the king and the Green Lady. They are in this place, residing on a mountain. And this mountain, by the way, is not the mountain that they're forbidden to reside on. It was one that was analogous to it, but one which they were intended to live on. And their intended to live on was now fulfilled because of precisely what Elwyn Ransom did in defeating Weston and preventing another fall from happening. So anyway, but that comment about the pantheism, I think, is interesting there. He follows the stream. He's still, to some degree, thinking like Weston. So on page 180, he has to rid himself of a lot of the bogeymen of his own thinking, his own contemporaries' thinking on such things. He's blinded when he finally comes up out of the darkness, and he pulls him through a little hole in the roof of the cavern. He feels heat, and he's blinded by the light, we say. And then he looks around him, and when he looks around him, he says he seemed to see that he had been living all his life in a world of illusion. The ghosts, the damned ghosts, were right. The beauty of Perelandra, the innocence of the lady, the sufferings of saints, and the kindly affections of men were all only an appearance, an outward show. So thinking with the mind of Weston, really. What he had called the worlds were but the skins of the worlds, a quarter of a mile beneath the surface. And from thence, through thousands of miles of dark and silence and infernal fire, to the very heart of each, reality lived. Now that sounds exactly like the way Weston had just spoken. The meaningless, the unmade, the omnipotent idiocy to which all spirits were irrelevant and before which all efforts were vain. Whatever was following him would come up that wet, dark hole, would presently be excreted by that hideous duct, and then he would die. He fixed his eyes upon the dark opening from which he had himself just emerged, and then, I thought as much, said Ransom, slowly, shakily, with unnatural and inhuman movements, a human form, scarlet in the firelight, crawled out onto the floor of the cave. It was Unman, of course, dragging its broken leg and with its lower jaw sagging open like that of a corpse. It raised itself to a standing position. So he thought he had rid himself of it. He has not yet rid himself of the Unman finally, but this is his point of utmost trial, because now he is even thinking the despairing thoughts of the Unman. He feels forsaken. Everything seems meaningless. He is talking like Weston had spoken not that long ago. And yet here is his moment of utmost triumph. And he sees behind the Unman some sort of creepy crawly things, and he can't even properly identify what it is. But he says horrible things followed, angular, many jointed legs, and presently, when he thought the whole body was in sight, a second body came following, and after that a third. The thing was in three parts, united by a kind of wasp's waist, so it's like an ant. I think what Lewis is describing here is something that he also leans upon in what I think is, to some degree, a companion passage, at least in terms of his fiction. He also uses this in The Silver Chair, if you recall, when he's going down into the lands of the underworld, and the subterranean realms, if you recall. And remember, through those realms, they were going to dig under the kingdom and then pop up and overcome it. The same sort of landscape is being described here in this fiction. And he says, they want to frighten me, in Ransom's brain, and at the moment he became convinced, this is a telling moment, both that the Unman had summoned this great crawler, and also that the evil thoughts which had preceded the appearance of the enemy had been poured into his own mind by the enemy's will. The knowledge that his thoughts could be thus managed from without did not awake terror, but rage. Ransom found that he had risen, that he was approaching the Unman, that he was saying things, perhaps foolish things, in English. Do you think I'm going to stand this? He yelled, get out of my brain. It isn't yours, I tell you, get out of it. And as he shouted, he picked up a big, jagged stone from beside the stream. Ransom, croaked the Unman, wait, we're both trapped, but Ransom was already upon it. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, here goes. Amen, said Ransom, and he hurled the stone as hard as he could into the Unman's face. The Unman fell as a pencil falls, the face smashed out of all recognition. Ransom did not give it a glance, but turned to face the other horror. But where had the horror gone? The creature was there, a curiously shaped creature, no doubt, but all loathing had vanished clean out of his mind, so that neither then nor any other time could he remember it, nor even understand why one should quarrel with an animal for having more legs or eyes than himself. All that he had felt from childhood about insects and reptiles died that moment, died utterly, as hideous music does when you switch off the wireless. And so something akin to the water snakes in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner is his. He sees not something insidious, malevolent towards mankind, but rather simply another creature like himself. And he loses all sense of antipathy towards it at that point. But he kills off Weston, which at this point is no longer Weston, but simply the body of Weston. And at that point, and does so in the name of the Trinity. At that point, and this is where I'm going to spend the rest. We move into chapter 15, 16, and 17. My main interest here for the next 20, 25 minutes or so. he then goes and ascends this high mountain. And there are creatures there, and tellingly there are 4 creatures there, something shaped like great earth beetles. And he said, assuredly the inside of this world was not for man, but it was for something. So he had a sense previously that there was no significance or purpose to anything. Now on this fixed land on which there's a mountain, he has a decided sense that there is a purpose to this. It's not for him, but there is a purpose there all the same. And he has a sense of reverence to this. And he says that he has the sense that that he ought to, on the one hand, obey what he sees there, and in another sense, he has that he ought to feel that he doesn't belong there. So looking back on the adventure, it says, afterwards it seemed to him that he floated out of blackness into grayness, and then into an inexplicable chaos of semi-transparent blues and greens and whites. And we already mentioned in our class that maybe these have some sort of liturgical significance, liturgical colors here. But he says that there was something in the air, and the wide silence which made a background to the lonely crying of birds told him that he was on a high mountain top. And he rolled around and he looked to the pool where he'd been, and looking back whence he had come, he saw a river pouring from the mouth of a cave that had seemed indeed to be made of ice. Under it was the water was spectral blue, but near where he lay it was warm amber. And there was mist that came out of it, and he just lay there. And as he lay there, he convalesced. He starts to regain his health and strength. Remember, he'd had this huge physical trial and combat, and now he is recovering from this. And he says, as far as the period of convalescence, I should imagine it must have been more like a fortnight or 3 weeks. And it was a time to be remembered only in dreams as we remember infancy. Indeed, he says, it was a second infancy. So there's a sort of a rebirth now. It's not the rebirth of that comes with baptism. It's not regeneration. It's not faith in Christ. He already had that. This is something different. Remember, this is fiction now. Lewis is not making a theological commentary about living the Christian life here. He's dealing in science fiction now. It's science fiction that's connected to his Christian faith, but it's building upon this in a certain way. So he has a sense of a second infancy in which he was breastfed by the planet Venus herself, unweaned till he moved from that place. And he had 3 impressions, and the 3 impressions were of rejoicing water, so the elements themselves rejoicing, another delicious life, which he sucks from the clusters of this fruit that's all around him, and the third is a song that he hears. A song, and the music is obviously corresponding to the music of the spheres, the planets, but also that which we hear in Tolkien's own fiction back in the making of the worlds in, let's say, the Silmarillion. There's a music there and a song, and he hears a song from this. And then he moves onwards from that. And there's a sense of steepness, translucence of the rock, but also steepness. And as he recovers, he then becomes aware of an injury that he had suffered that he had not really attended to, but now is the only thing that remains of his injuries. And that is that he has a wound in his heel. And the wound is bleeding, and he can't stop it from bleeding. And it's clear that it is a bite from a human mouth. He had somehow been bitten by the Unman, and the bleeding can't stop and doesn't stop. I think Lewis is obviously making an analogy here, symbolically speaking at any rate, to the reference to the enmity between the Son of Man and the serpent, that he will that the serpent would bruise his heel and he would crush his head. Remember, Lewis has just crushed the head of the Unman with a stone, and the stone, you could make some sort of analogy to Christ if you would, but certainly his heel has likewise been bruised, or in this case, it's bleeding from that. So again, analogies abound here to what's going on. He leaves a memorial to Weston, and then moves on from there through a forest, and sees something black there. And this black thing is a singing thing. It's a beast of some sort, and it makes a beautiful song. And recall back in Lewis's The Magician's Twin, there's a lion that sings there as well. And here there's something like that, again, which is singing. And he goes through this, and he feels like he's climbing. And the climbing is not a process, he says, but rather a state in which he's content. So he's moving upwards, further up, and to some degree further in, is what is happening here. And he has this confused mixture of sensations, he can't entirely describe them, in which the peaks, here's the quote, 193, a sense of perfect duty to enter that secret place which the peaks were guarding, combined with an equal sense of trespass. It's a holy place, in other words. He's being drawn in, and at the same time, he realizes there's a sense of reverence about it. And then he finds where he's been drawn. Well, he's been drawn to a coffin. And the coffin, of course, is lying with its lid open, the same way he began his adventure. Now, he could have left off the fiction at that. Okay, so now he's got to the place where he's come to the end of his journey, and now he's going to get back in the coffin and go back. But then, but he doesn't do that at this point, and the story does not end there. Then comes the more puzzling and interesting part of the whole fiction. And that is his description of what happens in chapter 16 and 17. Chapter 16 are theologizing to some degree. And this is obviously fictive theologizing, but it is nonetheless theologizing on the pattern of what they will then see on the mountain, and the importance of it. And in this, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. And it seems to me Lewis is pulling this from his own readings of the medieval period, and reflecting on a couple of things that we're going to put under the heading of theosis. On the one hand, theosis being a process whereby man is to become as a god. Very important in Eastern Christianity is theosis. It's the understanding of transformation and of becoming in the image and likeness of God. It's taught in both the Eastern Orthodox Church and also the Eastern Catholic churches. And it comes about through a process of purification. Through the contemplation of God in his own nature, one becomes more like him. And this is to some degree what I think is going on here. And it's not an intellectual process per se. It's more of one of participation and of union. And he encounters it first through an acquaintance with two figures. And the two figures come to be recognized as the two Oyarsa of the two planets he'd just been on. On the one hand, Maleldil, which he'd left, Mars, and on the other, the planet on which he has just found himself in this adventure of Perelandra. The former is male, or masculine rather, and that is Mars. The latter is feminine, namely Venus. And he hears them talking, and they're talking about here, and Ransom speaks to the former and recognizes him as Malacandra, but he calls him Oyarsa, and he says, I'm not Oyarsa here, because Oyarsa is the ruler, and he's not on his own planet. He's in a different place. And he says, here I am only Malacandra. And the other says, I am Perelandra. And he says, I don't understand. The woman said there were no Eldila in this world, to which she responds, they have not seen my face till today, said the second voice, except as they see it in the water and the roof heaven, the islands, the caves, and the trees. I was not set to rule them, but while they were young, I ruled all else. And this is the interesting thing about what goes on here. Because of what Ransom did in defeating the Unman, a different history will take place on the planet of Perelandra than that which took place on planet Earth. On our planet, the necessity of Christ taking on a human form and atoning for mankind's sins was necessary. So the incarnation. After that, of course, as we've already learned from Lewis's fiction, everything else changed. All rational beings would take the image of God, which is why we have the Green Lady and the King. But also there's a different future possibility for them. And thanks to Ransom's actions, that was in fact going to happen. But Malacandra says, page 197, this particular world, Perelandra, the world is born today, said Malacandra. Today, for the first time, two creatures of the low worlds, two images of Maleldil that breathe and breed like the beast, step up to that step at which your parents fell, and sit in the throne of what they were meant to be. It was never seen before. Because it did not happen in your world, a greater thing happened, but not this. Because the greater thing happened in Thulcandra, this and not the greater thing happens here. So the greatest thing of all had happened on Thulcandra, namely when God himself took on human form. Nonetheless, there's a sense given here that something great has been prevented by Ransom's actions, and Ransom feels a sense of guilt here. And so Elwyn is falling to the ground, said the other voice. Be comforted, said Malacandra. It is no doing of yours. You are not great, though you could have prevented a thing so great that deep heaven sees it with amazement. Be comforted, small one, in your smallness. He could have prevented something that Maleldil would have done, which would have been even greater than what he had done in the incarnation. All the same, be comforted. He lays no merit on you. Receive and be glad. Have no fear lest your shoulders be bearing this world. Look, it is beneath your head and carries you. Will they come here? Reference to the lady and the king. They will. They're already on the mountainside. How shall we appear to them? And then there's this interesting discussion about bodies and how one sees them and so forth. And they present themselves, that is the Perelandra and Malacandra, the two archons, the spiritual beings, present himself in terms that he can see. They try it 3 times. At first, he just sees blinding light and it overwhelms him and he screams at them to stop. The second, they see something like rolling wheels, the same sort of vision that we see at the beginning of Ezekiel, which make him feel sick. And then they try a 3rd time and they see 2 human-like figures, and on the opposite side of a lake, and they're about 30 feet tall. And they explain to him, we're not here in the same way that you're here. And they talk about relation and body and movement and so forth. I will skip over all that. But what we get then is a description of gender as well. And this is really interesting, I think, for discussions of sex and gender and so forth, what we mean by the two. He says they're creatures of a hypersomatic kind, and they appear to us in a certain way. But and even though they're akin to angels, they don't appear like angels as we have them portrayed in our art. But what they do see, he does see, is charity. That's the term he uses. Terrifyingly different from the expression of human charity, which we always see either blossoming out of or hastening to descend into natural affection. Nothing to do with the natural affections, which are, because of human sin, perverted in some ways. So there's no correspondence here, and yet nonetheless, it's pure spiritual, intellectual shooting from their faces. How do they differ then? Because here are the analogies he gives. Malacandra was like a rhythm, and Perelandra like melody. He has said that Malacandra affected him like a quantitative, Perelandra like an accentual meter. He thinks that the first held in his hands something like a spear, but the hands of the other were open, with the palms towards him. And Ransom at that moment saw the real meaning of gender. Gender is not an imaginative expression of sex, he explains. Sex is, in fact, merely the adaptation to organic life of a fundamental polarity which divides all created beings. Female sex is simply one of the things that have feminine gender. There are many others. And masculine and feminine meet us on the planes of reality where male and female would be simply meaningless. Masculine is not attenuated male, nor feminine attenuated female. On the contrary, the male and the female of organic creatures are rather faint and blurred reflections of masculine and feminine. So Lewis is getting into the sense of disordered order, which is being presented in the literary theories even of his own day. Finally, I'm going to move on from that to the final depiction in chapter 17, because I'm running short on time here, of Tor and Tinidral. Tor, the king, and Tinidral, the queen. And there's some really interesting sections here, I think, where Lewis talks about, and he talks about this and this is the aspect I talked about in terms of theosis. He writes in a letter, and the letter's to a man by the name of Victor Ham, August 11th, 1945. And he's talking about the meaning of the angels here. And their purpose there is to, unlike the incarnation on earth, is to lead the king and the queen to their place, at which point they become mere servants. And Lewis's comment to Victor Ham is this. He says, the only point I can think is when you use Martian society too boldly as a guide to what Perelandra would become later on. And he says, there is no parallel. The incarnation has come in between. And as such, Thulcandra brings to the old order, in which planetary creatures were subjected to the angels, but the angels kneel before Tor. There is no limit to the future glories of the world, which, needing no redemption itself, yet profits by the incarnation. And so there's a sense of the incarnation as the pivotal event in the whole of science fiction. It transforms all of life thereafter. And the purpose of these angelic beings here is to serve these two beings who have now become as gods. They've undergone a theosis, and the what we call eschatology, the teaching of the last days, is seen from another vantage point as the teaching of the beginning of things. And that's the vantage point in which Lewis talks about this here. And it at this point, the Oyarsa of this world is no longer Venus, but rather of Tor Oyarsa, which is how Perelandra speaks to him. He is now the ruler of the world, the king is, and they are there simply to serve his bidding. And so but he praises, does Tor Oyarsa, the work of Ransom in bringing us to this point. And so he says, and to you, Ransom, I say this, that you have called us Lord and Father, Lady and Mother, and rightly, for this is our name. But in another fashion, we call you Lord and Father, for it seems to us that Maleldil sent you into our world at that day when the time of our being young drew to its end, and from it we must go, now go up or go down into corruption or into perfection. Maleldil has taken us where he meant us to be, but of Maleldil's instruments in this, you were the chief. And so this is part of his work here. And one of the things that strikes Ransom, and I think is rather interesting, is how Tor should be the beneficiary of all these things, because he didn't go through the trial that he had undergone, and he didn't undergo the temptation that the lady had, and yet he is the heir of all these things. And the explanation is fascinating. And the king speaks to his thoughts here. He says, he is thinking that you suffered, speaking to the green lady, Tinidral, and strove, and I have a world for my reward. It's not justice. It's not fair. And he turns to Ransom and says, you're right. I know now what they say in your world about justice. And perhaps they say well, for in that world, things always fall below justice. Justice is what rules everything. But here, Maleldil always goes above that even. And he says, all is gift. It's all of grace. I am Oyarsa not by his gift alone, but by our foster mothers. Not by, in other words, Perelandra, not by hers alone, but by yours, Ransom. And not by yours alone, but my wife's. Nay, in some sort, by gift of the very beasts and birds. He didn't deserve any of it. It's all of grace. And that is what has raised him to this position, that he exalted position that he's in. It's wholly the work of others. It's wholly a gift. Through many hands, enriched with many different kinds of labor and love, the gift came to me. It is the law. The best fruits are plucked for each by some hand that is not his own. And this is the nature of God and how he has worked here. Now, one final thought here is that they come to the beginning, and the beginning of things, which in our world is called the eschatology, the teaching of last things. Here he refers to, from another vantage point, as the beginning of the great game, the great dance. This is the word perichoresis, the great dance of God, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, in this the grand dance that's also referred to in Eastern Orthodox thought. And there's one final reflection, and that is upon the heel of Ransom. And what comes from the heel is blood. And the lady notes it, and she looks on it with awe, and she says, and this is the substance, this is Hru, and this is the substance wherewith Maleldil remade the worlds. It's an extraordinary passage. And it concludes this. So there's a theological theologizing, there's a process of theosis in which the king and the lady become as archons on their own world, and Ransom has played a pivotal role in that. And with that role now prepared and his experience, he now goes back to planet Earth to take a part in the final matter, which will be fought out on planet Earth. We'll pick that up when we look at that hideous strength next time.